Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. That's always the issue with these Zoom webinars. You can't see anybody, so you have to trust that your voice is going out into the ether, kind of like doing a radio broadcast. My name is Louis Johnston. I am the current president of the Minnesota Economic Association, and I'm here to welcome you to our annual meeting for 2021. I wish I could see all of you in person. I'm sure you wish the same thing. We weren't able to do our meeting in person last year because of the pandemic. When we met to plan this year's meeting, we were hoping that we might be able to do it, but it became pretty clear that we certainly weren't going to be able to do it this year either. So my theme in thinking about today is next year in person, perhaps next year in St. Paul, for example. So let me begin by first giving you an overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to have a few remarks that I'm delivering right now. The centerpiece of our meeting today is our distinguished lecturer, Travon Logan from The Ohio State University. He will be delivering the annual or semi-annual, as I'll explain in a moment, Hurwitz Lecture. Then after his presentation, and we have a chance to talk with him, we will recognize this year's student paper winners. And then we'll have some closing remarks and adjournment from our incoming president and her representative. So one of the most important things that I always want to do is recognize our institutional members. This organization runs in part because of these institutions that believe that having an association focused on economics, both theoretical, applied, policy, history, all of the things that we all study is important to the state of Minnesota. So I won't read all of the institutions, they're there on your screen. One that I do want to mention in particular is the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis has been the host of the Minnesota Economic Association for many, many years, and I just want to publicly thank them. We're going through a transition this year. We're moving the hosting duties from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis to here at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. But the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis has made this organization possible for so many years, and I, again, want to publicly thank them for all of their support. I also want to thank our board and our officers. And here I will note a few individuals. Our president-elect is Lynn McDonald from St. Cloud State University. Our secretary is Liang Ding from Macalester College, and I especially want to thank him because he is the person who ran and made sure everything happened on the student paper contest, which we will recognize those winners after Dr. Logan's seminar. And the money person, Dr. Wan Young Kim from Augsburg College is our treasurer, make sure that our books balance and all of that kind of thing. So I want to thank our directors, and if I forgot anybody on this list, I apologize. My notes, I noticed, were not as good as they ought to be. So thank you to all of the directors, and if anyone's not listed there, a special thank you for indulging my ignorance. The centerpiece of our annual meetings is a distinguished lecture. During even years, it's named for Walter Heller, longtime economist at the University of Minnesota, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and one of two people who I think many of us consider the patron saints of economics in Minnesota. Last year, we were honored that Dr. Lisa Cook of Michigan State University delivered our Heller Lecture. Her lecture was on the relationship between violence and patenting in the United States from the late 19th century through the mid 20th century. And I still remember some of the lessons that I learned from that talk and the good discussion that we had. This year's lecture, since it's an odd year, is named for the other patron saint of Minnesota economics, Leonid Hurwicz. And this one holds a special place in my heart, if you'll indulge me for a moment, because I knew Leo. I had the honor of having him as the chair of my senior honors thesis when I was at the University of Minnesota, and was thrilled when he was awarded the Nobel Prize for all of his work. Many of you know his accomplishments, so I won't go through them, but one of the things that I think that's always interesting about Professor Hurwicz is that he was one of the people who developed the idea of the sub-caucus for our caucus system for the Democratic and Republican parties in Minnesota. So he wasn't just a theoretical person, he was a down-to-earth practical man and a very kind person. And so I'm very happy that today's speaker, Dr. Travon Logan of The Ohio State University, accepted our invitation to deliver the Hurwicz Distinguished Lecture. In particular, Dr. Logan is the Hazel C. Youngberg Trustees Distinguished Professor of Economics at The Ohio State University, where he's been on the faculty of the Department of Economics since 2004. He's also a research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research and has been a visiting scholar at Princeton University and has been a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Scholar in Health Policy Research. One of the things that I emphasize with my students is the question, who cares? We should always be asking, why do we care about a particular topic or a particular question? And when you read Dr. Logan's work, you don't have to answer, you don't have to even ask that question. You see why it's important. His work ranges from nutrition and well-being in the late 19th century to dowries in South Asia, to basically understanding gambling in the National Football League, to the work that I think has especially grabbed my attention, segregation, and how segregation developed, and in particular, how you can identify racial and ethnic segregation using census data. His work with John Parman has created a technique that scholars all over the world are now applying to these data in order to tease out these patterns of segregation. So I think that his work is so important that I'm thrilled that he's with us today. Let me just add, he earned his bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, earned his MA in demography and his MA in economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. And finally, one last thing, he is, despite living in Ohio, a Minnesotan. He grew up in St. Paul and graduated from St. Paul Central High School. So for all of those reasons, we are thrilled, and I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Travon Logan. Dr. Logan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm very honored to be speaking to all of you today. I hope that you can all hear me well. I am in my office, and of all days, there is a construction project right outside. So I'm hoping that I'll be loud and clear as I move into this lecture here. So I thought in coming up with this as an idea for what I wanted to speak about today, I didn't want to do sort of a traditional distinguished lecture where you sort of have the grand ramblings of someone talking about a lot of things. But I wanted to encourage you to think with me about where we are in our discussions of race and economics, and how they reveal tremendous progress, but also have distinct limitations. And it reflects on the current state of my own field of economic history. And we know, and I don't have to say to this audience, that economists are important. So thinking about how we think about things is important as well. So First, I want to start with some definitions. And what is economic history? My definition of economic history that I want to use throughout this talk is a bit more expansive than one that we might traditionally see. I think of economic history as partially the application of economic theory, certainly issues of measurement and analysis to historical events. I want to emphasize that the comparative advantage of an economic historian is their knowledge of history, truly bringing in those contextual factors that are important to understanding the past and that have illuminative potential for the present. I think it should be motivated by both historical and economic questions. And I think that identification and causal effects, as it were, are of secondary importance to actually understanding the past. So what do I mean by race? I'm talking about sort of race in the sense of economic history. There are several different ways of defining race. Traditionally, as social scientists, we think about race as a social category, something that is immutable and unchanging. And a more expansive view thinks about race as a social construction, as really something that is a part of our collective social psychology, which helps us to solve problems in the world. You can also think about race as being something biological or genetic, if you would like, or we can think about something that is not necessarily displaying for the next time. I want to push against something that would make race physical or biological. And I want to emphasize that race is a political construction in addition to being a social construction. And that's going to be particularly important for how we think where we're looking at these different trends. So race is also a social experience, right? Where we think that race is, and race actually should be, and we're thinking about this, something that people experience over their life. It has implications for other dimensions of their existence. So my definition of race, and this will be something that I'm going to come back to several times, is that race is a political construction. And I'm taking this idea really from Dorothy Roberts, who talks about this quite convincingly. If it's a political construction, then race is inherently economic, right? And it's about the distribution of resources, and it's about power. And race is an experiential state that varies in its material consequences and its psychological impact over the life course, such that race is really dynamic. And I think that's going to be important when we think about historical dimensions of race. It is understanding that this is dynamic. And the politics of this tells us that it is something about economics as well. So my last definition, what do I mean by sin? By sin, I'm not thinking of wickedness and things that damn us literally, say, to hell. I'm thinking about sin as hamartia, right? That it's missing the mark, that it's not doing what we have intended to do. And it's not a flaw that needs to be intentional or deliberate, but its impact could be devastating, right? And it's important to emphasize that my use of sin here is not about villains and about evil acts, but it really is about missing the mark or the lack of inclusion, really a sin of omission. So today I want to think about three venues where these sins appear and discuss why they are important for debates that we have today. And these definitions I gave will be important in thinking through these three venues that I want to talk about. The first being enslavement as production, and I'm moving in chronological order here. The second is segregation as an urban phenomenon. And the third is labor market discrimination and public accommodations discrimination. So in the first venue, when we're thinking about the economics of American slavery, is where we come up with enslavement and production. And there's this very large literature among economic historians and narrative historians, and now increasingly political historians and other social science historians, that look at American enslavement. And economic historians moved the focus to the economics of the enslaved economy. And narrative historians have followed suit and have recently asserted and seen enslavement as critical to the development of American capitalism. And so this new history of capitalism is really an outgrowth of an earlier generation of work done by economic historians. And in my own personal view, as much as the new historians of capitalism would like to fight against these economists, they're really in the same territory and have adopted the language that economists have used and focused on. There is a tendency in this literature to see the economic incentives of enslavement as really all-encompassing. This is not only among economists, but it's also among these contemporary historians as well, to think about the operation, in particular, of the plantation economy as something that is overwhelmingly guided by economic incentives, by the push for profit, by the need to have higher levels of output, that is the guiding force in how these institutions operated historically. Now, this becomes important when we think about issues such as punishments and productivity. And I'm going to talk about two issues in this particular venue: punishments and productivity. So what is the issue? The issue contains the purpose and the function of punishments on the plantation. You can think about this, and I want to focus it here on the debate about whippings. And you can think about whippings as either being relatively infrequent and much less effective than positive incentives in the plantation economy. Or we can think about whipping as something that is used to punish unproductive pickers and or to encourage higher levels of production amongst productive pickers. But in both cases, you're viewing whippings, you're viewing the punishments as being related to the enslaved economic productivity and therefore about profit. That whippings and punishment are a part of the production function. Either you're using them to create higher levels of production, or you're not using them because you're using some sort of positive incentive that is much more effective to produce higher levels of output. But inherently, this is something that's about the economics of this system. Now, many years ago, Vogel and Engerman in Time on the Cross had a calculation that the enslaved on the Bennett Barrow plantation experienced 0.6 whippings per enslaved person per year, which they used to argue that whippings were infrequent and that punishments were actually quite rare, which would be, if true, a major overturning of the narrative history of enslavement, particularly, say, since Stamp's Peculiar Institution talked about the normality and the normalization of severe physical punishments on plantations. Now, Gutman, in his critique of Vogel and Engerman's point, goes back to the Barrow plantation rolls and the diary, and he looks at the prevalence of whippings as described in those books. And what you will find is that the majority of whippings on the Barrow plantation amongst the cotton pickers would be the most frequent type of behavior observed in a 2-year period. That 75% of all of the enslaved people involved in cotton production were whipped at least one time. So We don't have any idea about other whippings that were unreported. Of the whippings that we have, we can say that they were visited upon 75% of the people. So the first thing we know is that punishments, in fact, were quite common on plantations. So the same statistic that told us 0.6 whippings per enslaved person per year also tells us that more than 75% of the people involved in cotton production met with one particular type of physical punishment. So punishments, in fact, were common. But that does not answer the question of its relationship to productivity. So was it the case that the most productive pickers were the least likely to be whipped? Right? This is key for understanding enslavement, an industry being consumed by its capitalist orientation. Is the whipping related to productivity, either in a positive way or in a negative way? What is going on? If I'm taking Fogel and Ingerman's idea about positive incentives, then the most productive workers should be the ones who are whipped the least. If I take, say, a new historian of capitalism message, then it would also have to be the least productive workers who will be whipped the most, because I need to punish them to, in fact, increase their production, for them to, in fact, pick more. So what Gutman does in Slavery in the Numbers game, he decomposes the most productive and least productive cotton pickers because the plantation records allow him to do so. Right? He knows who is picking the most, and he also knows who's been described as being whipped in the plantation diary. And what you'll find here is that this shocking fact that the number of whippings for the most productive enslaved people who are in cotton picking were in some instances more than double the whippings of the ones who are the least productive cotton pickers. So those who were, in fact, were the most productive, who picked the most pounds of cotton per day, were also the most likely to be met with punishment, and also, as recorded by Barrow, the most likely to have disorderly acts that raised the enslavers' ire. So the most productive cotton pickers were the most punished. If the enslaved who are the most productive are the most likely to be whipped, then there's likely no relationship between productivity and abuse. It's not the ratcheting system that some historians of capitalism would claim, nor is it a positive incentive system either. It is simply abuse, and it is a form of social, emotional, and psychological control. It may not be related to the production function at all. And we're missing something entirely in everything that I've just said. What we're missing is all of the other punishments that are metered out in the plantation economy. Sexual assault, jails, being chained, acts of public humiliation, being bitten by dogs, being caned, being waterlogged, being shot at, being sawed. What is sawing? Sawing is taking the jagged edge of a saw and hitting it against someone's hand. That is designed to be a particularly cruel punishment, but one that will not be permanently disabling. Now, none of these other punishments is mentioned in detail in the literature as being related to productivity, either by economists or the new historians of capitalism. So how should we think about them if we want to tell a story about punishments overall? The focus on whippings actually understates the degree of punishments and the options that enslavers had at their disposal. And so we have to think about the totality of this system and what punishments could actually represent. What are some of the other punishments that go beyond direct punishment, but include externalities to punishment as well? Remember that whippings are public acts, chiefly, and that other enslaved people are forced to watch that abuse. Another form of punishment is changing the names of children or relatives at the whim of the enslaver as a form of punishment and as the assertion of power. There's the forced performances that the enslaved had to do, once again, as a part of appeasement of the enslaver. They could also be made to procreate, which is a particular type of sexual violence that's visited upon enslaved men and enslaved women for the purposes of breeding. The perspective I want to bring into this, because it's going to go back to this definition of race that I had earlier, is actually from Hartman's Themes of Subjection. And what she talks about there is power. And what she's talking about is the need for this in the enslaver's mind to reinforce their power over every dimension of life. The exercise of power, she writes, was inseparable from its display because domination depends upon demonstrations of the slaveholder's dominion and the captive's abasement. This is very important then because punishments are not about productivity per se. This is a political demonstration of power, which is tied to an economic system. So neglecting the political gains and the political impetus behind the exercise of power and domination gives us a very limited view into what the production function actually was and the range of output that it's designed to produce. There is more than cash crops being produced in this system. Another thing that is being produced in this system are social roles. Another thing that is being produced in this system is social subjugation. Another thing that is being produced in this system is a racial hierarchy and the construction of race as a political reality. So all of that is tied to a political economy that we obviate if we're only going to focus on a production function for a crop. So punishment was political. And we have to think then about these as forms of political punishment and the exercise of power amongst the enslaved. So this is about distribution, also inherently political, because punishments are also distributed across and between the enslaved. Next, I want to talk about cotton and prices in a much more sort of straightforward approach in thinking about what we're missing in terms of the mark here. So we know that from 1850 to 1860, the supply of cotton was substantially above trend, and supply increases were met by increased demand due to low inventories and increased capacity to mill cotton domestically and particularly abroad, right? So that as the supply schedule was being pushed out, the demand schedule for cotton was being pushed out, in fact, higher than the supply schedule, which would lead us to having rising prices for the crop. Now, the overwork of enslaved people increased the cotton supply. And even in the face of this substantial demand shift, lowers cotton prices overall from what they would have been in a counterfactual without this increased labor. So this turns back to this question of sources of efficiency in Southern agriculture. So we're thinking here about the intensity of work, which is a gang labor system, an extensive division of labor within the gang, the extensive use of female labor, particularly pregnant women, and crop mixes that intensively use the land. I want to be very clear that when I'm talking about these sources of efficiency, to note that this is still an active area of research among economic historians. And so Paul Rohde, Alan Olmsted in particular, are continuing to look and tease out these types of relationships, particularly gang labor systems and division of labor within the gangs as being related to the productivity, this efficiency of Southern agriculture, which Vogel and Engerman used to describe the fact that the Southern economy, for the same given levels of input, produced about 30% more than the northern economy. And they find that this is concentrated in the labor input. So it is the extensive gang labor system. It is the intensive use of female labor. What do I mean by this extensive use of female labor in the plantation economy? So Logan and Engerman look at pregnant women and nursing mothers and the percentage of them who are picking in the fields by age and by their months and weeks before and after childbirth. So what you find is that enslaved women, even very young and some who are more aged, over 75% of them are working in the week before they give birth. Intensive cotton cultivation, picking somewhere around 100 pounds of cotton a day. They do retire from the field briefly for about 3 weeks after birth. But a month after giving birth, the vast majority, more than 2/3, have returned to the fields to work in physically taxing labor. This is why enslaved women as a population give birth to some of the smallest children on average that we've seen for human populations, because of the intensity of work while they are pregnant, and also the intensity of work immediately after they have given birth. So if we're thinking about this relationship between cotton supply and cotton demand, we're not including this dimension of overwork of pregnant women in particular as being important for this production function. And what that means about the lack of a capitalist orientation. If you, as an enslaver, own someone's human capital and you own the children that they produce, you are making a very short-sighted decision to have a pregnant woman work so intensively while pregnant and then immediately returning to work thereafter. It not only will have a negative impact on her health, it will also have a negative impact on the health of the child that will be born. But you own, as an enslaver, both of these people wholly, and yet this is an active underinvestment, what my colleague Rick Steckel calls a pernicious side of capitalism. But leaving aside these coordination problems, overworked enslaved people produce a great deal. But cotton demand remained high, and the incentive to produce drove a decision that led to further subjugation, but also decreases the potential for profits. If everyone would have coordinated and lowered their supply of cotton, you would have had even larger profits for the individual enslavers. So cotton yields would have in fact been lower than they were due to the lack of forced labor between, say, 1850 and 1860. I would suggest that demand would have been as strong as we saw because it was external to the United States, driven particularly by Great Britain. So cotton prices and therefore profits would have been greater than they were with enslavement, since enslavement led to overproduction. So if we're only thinking about the profits that enslavers reaped in the system, we're not thinking about the counterfactual that the profits would have actually been greater if this overwork of enslaved women would not have been present. So why does this matter? What are the consequences of these sorts of omissions in thinking about this? Well, there are consequences to the debate about reparations today. So much of the discussion about reparations has focused on modern and contemporary racial wealth inequality. And the idea behind that is that equating wealth either at the mean or at the median would be compensation for enslavement. It would be compensation for discrimination. It would be compensation for exclusionary policies and the capture of Black wealth from the founding of the nation down to the present, right? That the racial wealth gap captures all of that. But equating wealth at the mean or the median may understate the reparations due to the descendants of enslaved Americans, as the harms in enslavement exceed the racial wealth gap. If we think about legal cases where the family of surviving victims are compensated, we have to then apply that sort of rubric when we're thinking about enslavement, given what I was just mentioning about production, and given what I was just talking about in terms of profit. But let's first look at the issue of punishments. If we're thinking about this issue of punishments, I'm assuming that the punishments in enslavement are directly related to production, and therefore the profits that are reaped in that system go down through and determine the racial wealth gap. But what is missing is the fact that these punishments are not related to production. And therefore, if they sit outside of the production process, then equating racial wealth at the mean or median is not going to account for that. So the harms from enslavement could in fact exceed the racial wealth gap. So concluding this first venue, right, not accounting for punishments in slavery, which are not related for productivity, I argue, leads to an underestimate of the harms of enslavement. Not accounting for health effects leads to an understatement of the harms of enslavement. And not accounting for lower cotton supply and sustained demand understates the counterfactual profits that would have been made by, say, Black farmers if land would have been redistributed after emancipation. And we're missing in these things, there's a function of these sins, right? Neglecting the racial formations inherent to American enslavement causes us to miss the mark. Forgetting that racial oppression is an end unto itself in enslavement misses the mark in thinking about punishments and incentives in the plantation economy. Confining enslavement as an economic institution obviates the need to discuss the externalities from the economic to the social and to the political and vice versa. And the big point to make from this is that we're not focusing then on a really important point. In some recent work with Rick Hornbook at the University of Chicago, we're calculating the productivity effects of emancipation. And thinking about everything that I've just said, this point should be pretty obvious, right? That emancipation itself is the largest productivity gain in American history. Even if output, say cotton production, sugar production, tobacco production declined after the end of the Civil War, it is still the largest productivity gain. Why? Because you move 4 million enslaved people to their own management of time, which has value to them. And so the productivity gain from that shift in and of itself, depending on the way that we can calculate it, could be as much as 41% of US GDP at the time. So changing our perspective brings into light some of these things that we haven't thought about. So when we change the focus to the enslaved, this becomes immediately obvious. And all of this, in discussing this venue, I've tried to do is tilt it to a different perspective that allows us to have a sort of broader interpretation of what is going on that isn't confined to a narrow set of economic questions. So turn now to the second venue, which is segregation. And much of the discussion of historical segregation has focused on urban segregation, and it's focused on urban segregation, particularly in the 20th century and over the 20th century. And we have a story of segregation, and this involves many more than economic historians, but I want to concentrate on the economic historians for now, but a story that centers on cities. It looks at the rise of suburbanization. And it looks at the desire to have racially segregated public goods. So this is the traditional view of segregation over the 20th century in the United States, in cities, right? So these figures come from Cutler, Glaser, and Vigdor, who calculate segregation for cities by region in the United States from 1890 to 1990. And the well-established narrative now is that segregation reaches its peak in 1970 and then declines slowly thereafter, although it is higher than it has been historically. So when we do this sort of analysis for segregation, there are a couple of things that we're claiming here that I want to bring back in. The first is that we implicitly assume that rural segregation was constant and or that rural segregation is unimportant in explaining dimensions of inequality. We know segregation is related and correlated with lots of dimensions of inequality. But it also downplays the role of rural politics in the segregation process itself. Okay. So if we're looking at the United States in 1880, and I'm looking at the percent Black, this should not be a surprise, right, that the percent Black is highly concentrated in the South, in the former states of the Confederacy. And if we do traditional indices of segregation, we find the pattern that northern cities and northern locations are much more segregated than southern locations. And if we do the index of isolation, so these are both of the calculations that Cutler, Glaser, and Vigdor did for their segregation work, then we see here again that southern locations appear to be, the county level, less segregated than these northern places. Particularly, you can see this in looking at dissimilarity as relative to isolation. But in thinking about this and wanting to bring rural areas in, particularly to this historical dimension, John Parman and I developed a new method of looking at segregation. And what we did was we used the enumeration procedures in the historical census records that allow us to identify households, allow us to identify household heads, and allow us to determine the racial composition of a neighborhood down to the neighbor. So here we see from the 1880 census that we have a household identified. And this street is actually John Parman Street, where he lives today at William and Mary. And so this is the household identifier. This is the race of the household head. And here I have opposite race neighbors. Now we make the assumption in this calculation that the races are, that households are all of the same race, which actually at this time, it turns out to be true empirically in the data. But in looking at these opposite race households, we have a very different analysis of segregation. And what we see is that the supposed integration of the North, of the South relative to the North, is simply a subject of measurement. When we look at the actual physical distribution of Black and white households in neighborhoods, it turns out that the South is actually more segregated than the North. And what is this segregation related to? It is related to enslavement, right? It should be related to enslavement. If we're thinking about Black and white households, it should be related to where Black and white people are living. It should be related to enslavement. And it should be related to the percent of the free Black population as well. But what I note here, I think this is very important, is that we know slavery is changing from 1850 to 1860. And there's huge westward movement of enslavement. But those trends in movement of the enslaved and movement of free Blacks is not related to this segregation pattern. So it is a function of enslavement, but it is not a function of the dynamics of enslavement. Right? The changes in enslavement do not have an impact on this measure of residential segregation. And we know that the institution of slavery is changing over this time period, particularly in its westward movement. So exploiting this enumeration, details of the census, reveals that our traditional urban measures of segregation do not paint the most accurate story or picture of segregation. We also see that simply using percent Black in a county, for example, is a poor predictor of its segregation pattern. So this is looking across the United States at the county percent Black and this measure of neighbor-based segregation. And what you do see is a positive relationship. You do see segregation on average increasing if the place is larger in terms of its percent Black. But what you see is that this relationship, probably the only time I'm able to say this to my students, is it's homoscedastic, right? The variation around any point estimate, if I was drawing a line through this pattern, is actually equal variance on either side of it. So knowing my percent Black is far less informative for telling me how segregated a place actually is. If you do this at the enumeration district level, you get something that looks much more like a Jackson Pollock painting, right, in terms of a lack of a relationship. That percent Black at a really micro level, geographic, spatially, tells us much less about segregation than we might predict that a place that is more heavily African-American should be more highly segregated. And if we look in the South, in the enumeration districts, we see that relationship is also very scattered. There's a lot of variation in these places, in these rural places, that we have not accounted for in segregation patterns that probably are particularly important. So not only does rural segregation tell us something that cannot be elicited by county population shares by race, but this variation in rural segregation is related to outcomes that are important in understanding our past, in particular, our racially violent past. So with John, again, and with Lisa Cook, last year's lecturer, we have looked at the relationship between this neighbor-based measure of segregation and Southern lynching. And we find that an increase in a one standard deviation increase in segregation would lead to a prediction of an additional lynching in a county. And this is important because lynchings themselves occur predominantly in rural areas, not in urban areas. And so to investigate this relationship between segregation and racial violence, we need a measure of segregation that is going to capture something about rural segregation, which city-based measures of segregation simply cannot. And so we see here that this measure of segregation, this neighbor-based measure of segregation, is a strong relationship with lynching that does not exist for the other traditional measures of segregation, which are done and calculated. Primarily, they're sort of built off of essentially Gini coefficients over space. And if we're thinking about this relationship with segregation, it has a much stronger relationship with explaining Black lynchings as opposed to explaining white lynchings. So that this overall relationship is actually heightened for lynchings that are about interracial violence, interracial racial violence. This is important because we also should understand that rural segregation changes over time. So increasing segregation, that first picture that was showing segregation increasing from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, is about cities. And we have a story about cities and the Great Migration and the movement out to suburbia among whites and the creation of suburban communities as a response to this influx of African Americans. But this increasing segregation is not about the Great Migration and the creation of a Black urban core. That is part of the story. But what's going on in Western North Carolina that is increasing segregation there? Or what is going on in Western Louisiana that is increasing segregation in parishes there? These are the places that African Americans are leaving in the Great Migration. And we do see increases in the places that they're going to, but the segregation is increasing in the places that they are departing from. So there is not this monocausal relationship here with segregation. And when we turn to cities themselves, the story of segregation is also more nuanced and complex than simple population shares would show. So if we're looking here, this is New York City and its 5 boroughs. And the segregation index, the neighbor-based segregation index in 1880 and in 1940. And New York City becomes much more segregated. But in fact, this change in segregation varies over the boroughs of the city. Manhattan in particular becomes much more segregated than any of the other boroughs in New York. If we look at the percent of white households with a Black neighbor, right, by borough in 1880 and in 1940, what we see is that whites with a Black neighbor decline over time. Equally important, the percentage of Black households with a white neighbor decline, and declines precipitously over time. In fact, this relationship is stark, right? In Manhattan, for example, 40% of Black households had a white neighbor in 1880. In 1940, only 7.25% of Black households in Manhattan had a white neighbor in 1940. So this segregation varies itself even amongst the boroughs of the city. And ignoring the ways that residential sorting changes in rural areas focuses us on an urban story to the neglect of a national change in segregation. And the correlates of segregation have import for urban and rural areas. So what are the big things that we're missing here in this particular venue is we're missing the political factors that are related to the national increase in segregation. It is important to not think about segregation as a story of geography, but to think about segregation as a story of politics. And understanding it as a political story is critical in explaining our contemporary politics as well. And understanding it as a political story makes it, and it's a story about race, makes it a story about race and economics. So this is what we're missing in this particular venue. And the third and last venue I'll talk about are public accommodations and public accommodation discrimination. We have in economics broadly, and we have in economic history in particular, a very deep and thick literature which looks at the impact of non-discrimination policy on employment and in schooling. What we neglect here is that the largest venues for protest in the early and mid 20th centuries in the civil rights movement were about public accommodations. So if we're thinking back to the Plessy decision, it was about streetcars. And we fast forward to 1955 to the Montgomery bus boycott, again about public accommodations. The Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, again about public accommodations. The streetcar protest earlier in the 20th century, again about public accommodations. We have a lot of social attention and a lot of activist attention devoted to public accommodations, but very little in our economic toolkit to analyze public accommodations discrimination. So in another project with Lisa Cook and Maggie Jones and David Rose, we have analyzed the Green Books. And the Green Books are these travel guides for African-American travelers published continuously from 1936 until 1964 that list places of public accommodation that are non-discriminatory. And this is a sample of the Green Books from 1956, listing, for example, in Adrian, Georgia, that the Wayside tourist home on US Route 80 is a place where African-Americans can stop and have a hotel room as they are traveling about. And we've tracked and looked at these places of public accommodations over time, seeing their growth, in particular, growth of places like eating and drinking establishments, formal accommodations, informal accommodations, which were quite numerous at that time, because the discrimination in hotels meant that private individuals opened up their homes to African Americans traveling about. But do these green books give us sort of coverage of non-discriminatory businesses, right? So we're using this as a source. And I am going to turn to a traditional question of measurement of, are we capturing something in this national data set? Well, when we go and we compare the Green Book establishments to other independent sources, such as the Wisconsin Black Business Directory, we find more establishments listed in the Green Books than we see listed in other contemporaneous sources. When we go and look at the number of Green Book establishments and we look at the number of Black-owned businesses in the census of business, we once again are capturing a larger number of establishments in the Green Books, even than what we have in administrative data, which in the 1930s listed the race of business owners. And if we look at what these Green Book places are telling us about, they're talking about really mundane things, right? As I was mentioning, it's eating and drinking establishments, it's formal lodging, it's hotels. This makes sense. It's a travel guide with list informal accommodations, and then it lists these other sorts of places, gasoline stations, beauty and barber shops, even down to pharmacies. Painting this national picture of public accommodations that are non-discriminatory, which can be seen all over the United States over the history of the Green Book's publication. But where are these businesses actually located within cities, right? And not the business, there are businesses located in rural areas as well, which is important. But how does this match to racial sorting in urban areas, right? And if we're thinking about these places that provide non-discriminatory services, in this city of New York that I was just describing as a place that was increasing in its segregation over time, we see that the Green Book businesses are located in areas that are heavily African-American, and in areas in these HOLC maps are redlined as hazardous locations. So they tend to be concentrated in places where there are African-Americans and in places that were described in the 1930s as places that were on the decline. Part of that decline, of course, was about the fact that these locations were predominantly African-American. And if we look at Los Angeles, we see a very similar sort of trend, right? That if we're taking these cities, you'll find Green Book businesses in the places where African-Americans were living, which makes a lot of basic sense. And so predominantly, Green Book businesses, these non-discriminatory public accommodations, are in places that are redlined as being hazardous, most prominent places that we, or they'll be in places that have no grade. And what are no grade places? No grade places are central business districts, right? Because there aren't many residences there, so they are not zoned as anything in these redlining maps. So those are the most frequent places that we see there. But Green Book establishments are also related to segregation. And so places that are more segregated tend to have more non-discriminatory businesses. But how can we think about the relationship between non-discriminatory businesses and the political climate about non-discrimination? It's important to note that if Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 were invalidated, 5 states today could immediately return to separate but equal accommodations and practice racial discrimination in their public accommodations. When we take this relationship to Polly Murray's excellent Handbook of Laws of Race and Color in the United States, published in 1950, we find that the number of non-discriminatory businesses at the state level is correlated with the number of anti-discrimination laws at the state level. So there are more non-discriminatory businesses in states that have more anti-discrimination laws on the books. It's also the reverse, right? We find fewer places that have non-discriminatory public accommodations when there are more discriminatory laws on the books at the state level. And this is important because this tells us that there is this relationship between politics and public accommodations discrimination. Firm owners consistently noted during the civil rights movement that integrated policies would drive their white customers to competitors because they understood their white customers to have strong discriminatory preferences. And empirical evidence and the historical narrative point to strong discriminatory preferences amongst white consumers. requiring federal intervention to simply ban the practice of discrimination in public accommodations. So what are the sins there? That labor market discrimination is about firms and about business owners and about labor and who they're going to hire. But public accommodations discrimination is about citizenship. Citizens of a country should be entitled to free mobility. And discrimination in public accommodations prevents that from happening. It is literally the creation of a second-class citizen. So these questions around citizenship and the role of consumers requiring discrimination have been neglected because the ban on discrimination in public accommodations takes those preferences sort of off of the table in terms of being able to analyze them or even think about them. But that doesn't mean that those preferences have disappeared. And it doesn't mean that there won't be other venues in which those preferences can manifest themselves. So the sins here is that thinking through the economics of public accommodations discrimination allows us to view debates around critical race theory and voting restrictions in a new light. These are new venues where discriminatory preferences can manifest themselves, and where, if we're economists and we're thinking about strong preferences for discrimination and the persistence of these preferences, then they can't have gone anywhere simply because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed. We are still fundamentally in a fight over citizenship and fights over the free movement for everyone in the United States. It should come as no surprise to us that we have intensive debates about things as pedestrian and mundane as restrooms, because those were exactly the venues that we had debates about public accommodations in the mid-20th century. We've simply changed the social group about which we're having this debate, which is fundamentally about citizenship. So this narrow focus of economic history has illuminated our understanding of the racial past, but only through the limited prism of sort of rational choice models, production functions, and it has not incorporated this larger, more expansive notion about politics and how race is politically constructed. So we are missing the larger issues that would help us to focus on why economic history can help us understand the present. It is not in that narrow focus, but in a more expansive focus that brings in the political constructions that undergird racial formations. So the question of citizenship goes all the way back to Hartman's point about the ways in which subjection takes place and its relationship to political objectives. And it's important to emphasize Hartman here because she is a scholar of literature, but she has import to how we as economists and economic historians want to describe the past. Because economic history is a humanistic endeavor. And so the insights of people like Hartman should guide our approach and open up the ways in which we're thinking about these historical experiences and these historical periods. Neglecting this political part of this, neglecting the expansive view of race in particular, leaves us unable to describe the economics of race and its importance outside of the limited range of topics that concern contemporary applied economics.
Well, thank you, Professor Logan. I wish we were all together so we could applaud out loud. So we'll do that like this virtually. There are already some questions in the Q&A, and let me remind the audience that we'd like to hear what you have to, some questions and things like that. If you can type them up in the Q&A, that would work great. Or if that isn't going to work, I can look for hands that are raised, and then if the technology works, perhaps even open up the mic if you've got a mic. So we'll start with some of the questions in the Q&A. Kunyet Orman asks and says, fascinating discussion, but he presents an alternative about the whipping and productivity data. He says, could it be that whippings were the reason why those workers who were whipped more were more productive? Whippings and other punishments are directly and positively then related to productivity. He wants to know what you think of this possible alternative hypothesis.
Yeah, that's a terrific question about thinking about the most productive workers being the most punished as a way, that's what it would describe as sort of particular type of ratcheting system. So there are two responses to that. One, we don't have in any of the diary entries evidence that the whippings are related to sort of daily productivity estimates in the way that some of the new history of capitalism has described it. And so that will be one way in which it probably isn't. But the second is, when I talk about acts of disobedience, the most productive pickers were also the most likely to run away. Right? So another act of these punishments is actually about other forms of disobedience that are not directly related to you have not picked enough cotton today. In Barrow's actual records in the plantation rolls, he describes going on and whipping slaves when they had low levels of productivity. So that would be very consistent with this ratcheting hypothesis. So I think that fully looking at the record, it certainly is a very plausible explanation that the most productive people are punished the most to get even more productivity out of them. But we don't see the behavioral response either in the intention of Barrow in his whippings as he describes it, nor do we see it as increases in the productivity of those who are whipped the most.
Thank you. A second question that's already in the queue is from Christine West of St. Catherine University. And she writes, the Mapping Prejudice Project has brought a lot of attention to racial covenants in the Twin Cities and the role these played in claiming white spaces and exacerbating segregation. And she wonders if you have thought about how covenants play into this larger narrative you're working on and how we encounter racism in economic history.
That is great. And I know the work, I'm going to blank on her name now, Sood, who is doing some great work with the mapping project in a paper that I like a lot. Because these covenants are so important, and we remember that the covenants are unconstitutional as of 1948, but they have persistent effects, and they lead to higher property values, they lead to more racially homogeneous communities, even after they're abolished. And so the persistent effects of this, I think, are quite important. And it's also important to know, because I want to tie the covenants in with another arc of literature that's out there, this large literature looking at, for example, redlining, looking at the FHA versus the Home Owners Loan Corporation and the differences in the maps and those sorts of things, which have recently received a lot of attention. But it's important to note that rural areas were also considered to be more or less hazardous by their racial composition as well. So when John and I were looking at segregation, one of the big questions that people ask us is, why do we care about rural segregation? And I hope that I've established that we should care about rural segregation. But the second point is, if you go back to the earliest, and I want to say these are published in like 1916, the Farm Bureau is making loans to farmers at this time. And they note, and one of the things that they talk about is, you need to know the ethnic/racial composition of the community, because if it's more homogeneous, we'd be more likely to lend money there. So people have long recognized that what they believe to be homogeneous populations are better economic investments. Now that stands exactly the opposite of what we think about today, which is these diversity bonuses and agglomeration economies that result from these cities. But historically, the belief was that homogeneous populations were better. And if we think about sort of the work that Claudia Golden and Larry Katz have done about education, one reason why Iowa is leading the nation in investments in education is, Iowa is a very homogeneous state. And so they find this relationship between investment in public goods and homogeneous populations, which again is linked to this larger process of suburbanization, where people are creating separate spheres so that they can share in public goods, and they're defining the public that they want to share these public goods with. That in and of itself, of course, is another political project, where we have these political incentives about public goods and their distribution, which of course is related to race.
Thank you. If anybody else has a question, please do either put it in the Q&A or in the chat. Let me see. I think I have another one here from Joe. Man, my technology is always not as good as it should be. So let me take a look and see if I can get that up here. Oops, having a little trouble with that. Oh, there it is. Okay. So let me read this. First of all, please ignore this if you don't want to discuss methodology. You talked a little about the process of social reproduction. Could you say a little bit more about how that takes place in a slave economy? Many social scientists tend to focus on functionalist explanations of social reproductions, but economists are trained to think about rational choice and methodological individualism. Do you think that, for example, plantation owners, overseers, etc., saw themselves upholding and perpetuating the institutions of white supremacy as an important part of their role, or was something else at play?
This is a great question. And if you read Gutman in his critique of Time on the Cross, one question he asked repeatedly, and he really is doing this to really stick it to Bob and Stan, is what do the enslaved know? How do they know it? And who did they learn it from? Right? These are really important questions that we want to ask, and that we tend not to really ask in economic history more generally, right? So we have to turn, right, for answers to that question. I would turn you to people like Hartman. I would turn you to people like Dorothy Roberts. They think about the construction of race. We don't have in economics a way of thinking about social reproduction, right? But this is what the narrative historians have been talking about for some time, right? If we think about Black engaged slave community, we think about Geneviese's role, Jordan Role, they're talking about how you form a culture around this institution of enslavement and what it means about how people are defining themselves and in their roles. And the main point about what Hartman is talking about when she talks about subjection is that it has its beginnings in this enslavement system, but it carries through to this very moment in ways that we don't think about, that are not designed around, for example, the physical punishments, but it's designed, for example, about racial performativity, which we still see to this day is about a subjection, right? Which I would view, taking, say, Robert's view, as a political process in and of itself, right? There are ways in which we have to create honorable African Americans who are victimized by a racist system, as opposed to even someone who is dishonorable who can still be victimized by the system. That is a racial performance and a form of social production. It was important for abolitionists to describe the enslaved in a particular way because it had to go and map to a moral worldview where the enslaved have to be the victims of the evil enslaver, right? And so that's another performance, right, that limits everyone in the ways that we're thinking about this. And so those are the ways in which it is an institution. Now, if you're thinking about to this question, how did the enslavers see themselves? I would go back to, say, Phillips, right? Because he's thinking about them and thinking about the enslaved system as something that is unprofitable, but that it served the social function of the white supremacist aims of the enslavers, right? So that would be his interpretation. That's how the first economic history of American enslavement is certainly about it as simply a social custom that did not have an economic function. What the economists later brought in was the fact that there was a lot of money to be made in enslavement. It was a profitable business. But what we have to move into this third venue is to understand and bring in the voice of the enslaved, right? And so the narrative historians have done a much better job of that to present than the economic historians. And when we bring that voice in, we reach some really fundamentally different conclusions about the American economy overall, right? So I'm still really intrigued in this work with Rick about this productivity gain. If I told you the biggest productivity gain came from emancipation, you probably think about it for 5 seconds, and then you realize, well, that probably makes a whole lot of sense, but that's never the way that we've conceptualized it. We talk about declines in output, right, that come with emancipation. We haven't thought about the value that people would have to themselves being able to own all of their time. Right? That is a productivity gain in and of itself. And it turns out when it's 4 million people, it's the largest productivity gain in American history.
Thank you. That was what I was thinking about, actually, just to have my own kind of question here was when you mentioned that this was the largest productivity gain in American history, being a student of Richard Such and Roger Ransom, I was like, well, yeah, of course they didn't work so hard because they had choice over their own time, and this has value. So thank you, though, for putting that right at the center. We have a question. How can we follow up with more information on this subject, and when will today's recording be available? I'll answer the second one. It should be available within a week. Our wizards here at St. John's and St. Ben's in the media services are going to edit it and make it all look nice, and so it should be done within about a week, and I'll send out the link to people. But Dr. Logan, if you were going to encourage some of the students, especially in the audience, to pursue some of these things, where would you tell them to start?
Oh gosh, there are some great symposia out there. I think one way to start, so thinking of the different venues, for the first venue, I really would start, actually, it's a small book, but it will lead you to the really good sources. Fogel wrote before his death, the Slavery Debates. It was a series of lectures, I believe, that he gave at Louisiana State. And that is a great way to review some of this history that is currently about the economics of enslavement. Eric Hilt has a great piece. I want to say it was in the Journal of Economic History that describes this history of capitalism debate in some detail. And I think it's missing some of the pieces that I was talking about, but I think that would be a great starting point for that particular venue. For the segregation work, I would say maybe reading John and my work in the Journal of Economic History, but now there's a series of work that's come outside of this, as Lewis was talking about. And so there are lots of people applying this method and looking at other places where it has a role. Another way to follow up on that is Jacoba Williams' more recent work that looks at the relationship between lynching and African-American voter registration, which is a fascinating project that she has been working on, which is related to this. For the third, there is relatively little work in public accommodations discrimination, and so we're just starting with this. Some great papers by Gil and Marion. There's about 3 or 4 papers that they look at, like streetcar protests and the economics thereof. But it really is the narrative history of the civil rights movement where you'll have more traction.
Well, there are no other questions in the Q&A, and we have taken a lot of your time. I just want to thank you on behalf of the Minnesota Economic Association and all the participants for your wonderful lecture. And we hope that we get a chance to maybe read a couple of books or something that summarize some of your findings too. Bring it to this wider audience. I know you have nothing else to do.
Yeah.
But someday it would be fun to read that. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And again, I'm just delighted to be honored to be asked to deliver the lecture. Thank you.
You're welcome. We have one more task to do, and it is a pleasure for me to start it up. Let me get the slideshow back up here. We have student paper winners, and I again want to recognize Dr. Liang Deng from Macalester College for shepherding this entire process and making sure that we had panelists of readers to enjoy these papers, and I was one of them, and I really did enjoy reading every single one of them. We have 3 categories of paper winners, and I just want to recognize each of those categories, and many of them are in the audience today. So first of all, we have a category for senior papers. Those are papers that usually are thought of as something you complete over the course of your senior year as like a senior thesis. And the first place in that category goes to Hannah Whipple of Macalester College. And the title of her work is The Effect of Racial Covenants on Modern Day Foreclosures, Evidence from Hennepin County. And her advisor was Amy Damon from Macalester College. So congratulations, Hannah. In fact, I saw you on the participants, so a very personal congratulations. The second place goes to Sarah Hussein of Carleton College. And her work is on the intersection of gender norms and intra-household bargaining power, evidence from garment workers in Bangladesh. And her advisor is Prathi Senavrati. And again, congratulations, Sarah. Third place went to Segwo Koko Lee of Macalester College. And her work is entitled, How Do Chinese Students Choose Which U.S. College to Enroll? and her advisor was Dr. Leanne Deng. So congratulations to all of our senior paper winners. If we were all together, we could have a big round of applause, and I'm sure many of you out in the audience there are applauding. Oops, clicked a little fast there. Well, I'm missing one of my slides. I am so sorry. We also have the contest for term papers, and I unfortunately don't have the names. This is very embarrassing, but that's the way some things happen right now. So I will send out the names of those, and Dr. Dung also already did that. But congratulations to those who were winners of the term paper competition. The third category is what we call communications. And this was a category that we created a few years ago to try to get at papers that people are writing that translate economic ideas and economic issues into more plain English to communicate to a wide audience. And the three winners in this category are, first of all, Cindy Guo of Carleton College, The Economic Case for Paid Family Leave. Again, Dr. Sinavrante is the advisor on this paper. Second place went to Samantha Mark of St. Catherine University on her piece on mothers in the workforce, and her advisor is Dr. Marina Gorzig. And finally, third place, there are four authors, co-authors, Bailey Davis, Saif El-Fatari, Karina Lara Isidora, and Drew Jackson of Hamline University, and their work on incarceration rates by race within U.S. counties with the advisor of Dr. Stacy Bosley was awarded third place. So congratulations to all of the winners of this year's paper contest. Those of you who are out there who are students who are returning, this is an opportunity for you next year. We'll send out the call for papers in the spring like we usually do, and we encourage all of our faculty members and any students out there to submit their work. As I said, I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm sure the other people on the committee did as well. We have one last piece of business, and that is to have Carmi Matson stand in for Lynn McDonald and officially close our proceedings for today. So Carmi, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, everyone. I am standing in for Lynn McDonald, who is the president-elect of the MEA. I am actually the past president of the MEA. I am the assistant vice president of regional outreach and public programs at the Minneapolis Fed. We'd like to thank all of you for coming today, and in particular, Dr. Logan, for that fascinating speech. We'd also like to particularly thank Lynn McDonald for stepping in as our president for next year, as well as a very special thank you to Louis for having served as our president this year and recruiting Dr. Logan as our speaker. And in particular as well, a thank you to St. Ben, St. John's and Louis for agreeing to take over the administrative role of managing the MEA going forward. We at the Minneapolis Fed greatly appreciate that. And if there are folks in attendance today who are economics professors who are interested in playing a role on the MEA board, I would encourage you to reach out to Lynn or Louis directly, or you can just type your name in the chat and we can follow up with you. Thank you so much to all those in attendance, to Dr. Logan, to Louis and Lynn and Liang, and thank you as well to all of the institutional members of the MEA for your financial support. Have a great day, everyone.